Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 3 as we look at this first portion of Judaism. And we finished up with some key terms and concepts, so let us move on to some rabbinical commentary. Well, to put these two together, you have first the Talmud, which are oral traditions later written down, later put into written form. And then by contrast, you have the Midrash, oral traditions not necessarily written down, but still carried on orally by the tongue. To give some examples of this, and I'm not sure if one of these specifically does come from the Talmud, because there's variations of the Talmud, or this is Midrash, but it has to do with some extra commentary, some extra rabbinical commentary regarding the potential sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham in the book of Genesis. If you go and look at what was taking place in that story before the potential sacrifice happened, there's a feast celebrating Isaac being weaned. What he is being weaned off of is not said specifically, but in any case, there is a feast celebrating this event. Well, during all the festivities, God is not mentioned, and God becomes upset about that. So essentially, that's when he asks Abraham to take your son, your only son, and offer him as a burnt offering to me. To which Abraham responds back, well, I have two sons. Because he has a son with Hagar, the slave woman, Ishmael. And then God responds back with, well, the one that you love. And Abraham states, well, I love them both. And then God states, the one whom I said I was going to make the covenant with. Well, that would be Isaac. Another example of rabbinical commentary, and I think this could be more the Midrash, though it could be in one of the versions of the Talmud, I'm not for certain, but it has to do with the death of Moses. Of course, in the Exodus journey account, Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, God informs him that I will let you get to see the promised land, but you're not going to get to enter it. And how Moses is said to have died in the rabbinical commentary is that God kissed Moses and Moses dropped dead. Anyway, continuing on here, two methods of understanding biblical inerrancy. That word inerrancy refers to without error, and I do understand that this is in the realm of faith, but so many people do view these particular texts as inerrant, so I thought that I would mention something about them, and I'm going to put these two terms together and then provide an explanation. Well, the first you have is literal. Well, the understanding of literal inerrancy would be that the Bible is inerrant in all aspects, but only in the autographs first editions, which we do not have. And then the second would be contextual. Well, contextual would be the notion about how on issues relating to salvation the Bible is inerrant, but that mistakes can be found in terms of history, grammar, science, etc. So, one of the ways of explaining these two different understandings, I think of something that Bart Ehrman told in his story that, ultimately led to him, becoming an agnostic atheist, though, as mentioned, it was the issue of theodicy, the problem of evil, that was the final straw. But there was something, kind of, I think, leading up to that. Ehrman having this very, literal understanding of Scripture, but then he would see contradictions within the text. And one of the things that he talked about was the story regarding picking grain on the Sabbath in the Gospel of Mark, where the Jewish leaders, more specifically the Pharisees, basically confront Jesus with, hey, why are your disciples, picking grain on the Sabbath and thus breaking the Sabbath, which would be working on the Sabbath? And Jesus responds back, well, didn't you know when Abiathar was the high priest during the reign of King David, and etc.? The point, though, with the story was that the actions of Jesus' disciples was okay. Well, Ehrman focused on one particular point within the story. If you look at where the story derives from in the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians would refer to as the Old Testament in 1 Samuel, it's not Abiathar who is the high priest. It's his father Ahimelech. Ahimelech is the father of Abiathar. Well, whom the actual high priest was is really a minor issue. I mean, it could have been Caiaphas, who was the high priest in Jesus' lifetime, which would not change the point of the story in Mark, which was that the action of Jesus' disciples was okay. But Ehrman focused on that point. And this is when he had transferred on to Princeton, and he wrote this 30-page paper where he argued that Abiathar in Mark was really Ahimelech. And he mentioned how the professor he had at Princeton was a very pious Christian, but probably also was somebody that was sympathetic to him. That Ehrman had this very literal view of Scripture, but he's got the text right in front of him showing a contradiction. So he writes this 30-page paper. The professor gives him an A on it, but at the end of the paper he wrote this one simple statement. Let me have a sip of water and I'll mention that statement. The professor wrote, maybe Mark just made a mistake. And Ehrman responded back with, well, that would have saved me 30 pages worth of writing if I had come to that conclusion. Well, someone in the contextual area would say, yeah, Mark just made a mistake. Whereas somebody in the literal area would state, no, Mark didn't make a mistake, but somebody who copied him made a mistake. Whether by accident or by intent, somebody copying him made a mistake. That Mark, the actual autograph of the Gospel of Mark, has it right. But somebody that copied him, for whatever reason, made a mistake. Anyway, moving on here, we've got Jews, Christians, and the use of numbers. Starting off here, the flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights in the book of Genesis. Moving on. The Israelites were in the desert for 40 years. Moving on again. Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days. Moving on even more. The ascension of Jesus takes place 40 days after the resurrection. And here's another one. These 40 Days of Lent, a traditional Christian hymn which is sung during the Lenten season if you belong to a liturgical tradition. Are you seeing a pattern here with the number 40? Yeah. 40 is a very popular number that's used by both Jews and Christians that is meant to essentially give out a significant amount of time, but it's not meant to be taken literally. Sometimes numbers are meant to be taken literally, yes, but often at times it's more of just a symbolic meaning for a significant amount of time. Like, I remember when I took the course over the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians would call the Old Testament. And I remember, like, the issue with the flood. The professor put it, it's not like the camera is rolling, and when you're on day 39 and then the clock strikes midnight, boom, all of a sudden the rain stops. No, it's meant to, detonate a significant amount of time, and this community would have understood that. I mean, the flood could have lasted a week. Or it could have even lasted 3 days. Or 5 days. I mean, that's plenty of time to cause a significant amount of damage. The Israelites could have been in the desert for a year. That's a long time to be in the desert. Jesus, he could have been in the wilderness for a week. That's a long time to be, in the desert. And, thinking about the ascension of Jesus, there are what's known as Gnostic texts, and I don't remember which one this was. May have been, I'm not sure which one of the Gnostic texts it was. I'd have to look it up, but that's a minor issue right now. But it mentions how, 330 days after his resurrection, Jesus appears before his disciples. Essentially, the number 40 here is a reference that that the ascension took place, where Jesus returns to heaven, a significant amount of time, after the resurrection. It's not like, the disciples were counting day 1, day 2, day 3. I mean, they probably weren't thinking how many days it's been since, they saw, Jesus after he was crucified. And so they just gave the number 40, which in the culture that they're from, the people would have known, oh, he was with his disciples a significant amount of time. Or, the hymn, the 40 Days of Lent. If you actually add up the days of Lent from Ash Wednesday to Holy Thursday, which is the date that Jesus instituted the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, it's not literally 40 days. It's a significant amount of time, yes, but it's not literally 40 days. That, in this case, the number 40 has a more symbolic meaning than a literal meaning, and here it's to mean a significant amount of time. Well, we need to stop here, but when we come back, we will continue on with this first portion of Judaism, so I will symbolically see you then.